Hello and welcome to my presentation on Homicide. This is by Sadie and this is the honors addendum version of the project. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Starting off with what is homicide. Homicide is the killing of one human being by another. Now this is a very applicable term, meaning that it can be used in a lot of different categories. This is going to be meaning that homicide is considered homicide whether the killing was lawful or unlawful, and whether it's grouped off into some subcategory under the law, meaning whether it's manslaughter, first degree murder, second degree murder, whatever the case is, it is still going to be considered a homicide. Now, it's important to note that while every murder is a homicide, not every homicide is a murder. So let's dive in and differentiate between these terms, figure out what it means. Okay, so starting off with first degree murder, so this is going to be the unlawful killing with premeditation by the defendant. So this means that, but with committing the crime, they had premeditation, intent, and deliberation in this murder. So what exactly does that mean? Let's take a look over here. So starting off with premeditation, this means that the defendant thought about the killing beforehand. They planned it out, they thought about it, they went in maybe for days, weeks, months, whatever the case is, even hours, knowing that they were going to do this. Next is intent. So that just means that they knew what they were doing, they meant to cause harm to this person, they knew what they were doing when they went into it. And then last, we're looking at deliberation. This is going to be the cool and calculated decision making of the defendant. So these three different points are going to be the perfect recipe to a first degree murder. Now, let's get an example of this. So an example might be if let's see, defendant writes out and plans to strangle coworker after their shift ends. So maybe they made a plan of how they were going to hurt this coworker. They lied in wait for the coworker, and then when they came out, they attacked, strangled, resulting in the victim's death. This would be a first degree premeditated murder. Let's keep going. Alright, next we've got second degree murder. So what is this? This is the unlawful killing with malice at before thought, but without premeditation. So what exactly does that mean? Let's look at the important factors here. So starting off, we've got things being intentional. However, it might be from a reckless act or one without a cooling off period. So this means that the defendant went in knowing that they wanted to hurt somebody. They went in trying to cause harm to the victim. However, it wasn't something that was planned out beforehand. It kind of just happened in the moment. So what's an example of this? Let's see, the defendant gets into a bar fight, maybe with somebody sitting next to them, and in that moment, in the heat of the moment, they get so angry that they lift up the stool next to them, crash it over that person's head, and the victim, unfortunately, it's a fatal hit and they die. This would be an example of second degree murder. It is still has malice, it is still intentful, however, it was not premeditated. Now, let's differentiate this from voluntary manslaughter. So, what is voluntary manslaughter? This is going to be the intentional killing mitigated by provocation in the heat of passion. So, what exactly does this mean? Well, this is going to differentiate from second degree murder because voluntary manslaughter is kind of that same recipe as before where, they didn't plan it out, it kind of happens in the heat of the moment, there's no cooling off period. However, the key point here is going to be mitigated by provocation. This means that any reasonable person, whatever they were provoked by, it's, reasonable to say that anybody else would kind of fly off the handle and lose self-control in that moment. So an example of this is going to be, let's say the defendant comes home from a trip and finds his wife cheating on him with his best friend. In that moment, he's shocked, he's angry, he feels betrayed, he grabs a knife sitting on the table next to him and just sticks it into his best friend's neck, fatally killing the victim. This is going to be an example of voluntary manslaughter. There was no cooling off period, it happened right in the heat of the moment. However, the circumstances existing around the murder kind of knock it down to a manslaughter because it shows that any reasonable person would have likely been very upset over what they witnessed, what they saw, resulting in them to fly off the handle. Now, moving on to our last type of manslaughter/murder is going to be involuntary manslaughter. Now, this is going to be the unintentional killing of someone that often comes from reckless or just criminally negligent behaviors. So, what are the important factors that we can see here? This is going to be no intent to kill or harm the victim, often from risky or unlawful behavior, and then the key point here is the absence of malice. So this is just going to be somebody who is maybe just being plain dumb. They're not paying attention, they're being negligent or risky, and it unfortunately results in the death of somebody else. However, they had no intent to harm anybody. For example, Maybe the defendant was driving home late night after work. They're on their phone watching TikToks while they drive. They happen to not see an elderly woman crossing the street, unfortunately hitting her and fatally killing her. This is going to mean that this is an involuntary manslaughter. They were just being reckless, they were being negligent on their phone while driving, but they didn't mean to cause harm. Alright, let's keep going. Let's see the evaluation or the evolution of potential punishments in homicide over the years. So, starting out back in the 1700s, we have something that is called bloody code. Bloody code. This was made in England, and it was when they really started to impose the death penalty. So this meant for any crime that was going on, somebody was basically going to be publicly executed. And in this, we saw hangings, we saw burning at the stakes, and even beheadings of people, again, very publicly. Whether it was a homicide or you stole a piece of bread, you had a very violent end to your life here. Now, moving on to the 1800s, I like to call this the Enlightenment period, because I think it's when we really see a difference from just kind of, without any care, just killing people who do something wrong, where they started to think, okay, maybe imprisonment could be in punishment instead, or maybe there is some morality to what we're doing here, maybe we need to look at this legally. And that's kind of when this structure of trying to figure out how that act impacts the society as a whole, looking at imprisonment, as mentioned, and actually sentencing the victims rather than just, killing off the defendant, whatever. Moving back another 150 years, we are going to look at the 1950s, which is going to be around the mid-20th century. So here's where death penalty controversy kind of really started to rise. So this is around the start of the civil rights movement, meaning that in this time, people were really starting to look at what happens that we get to decide to just, kill somebody with the death penalty. So I think that this is when those questions started to really rise. So while the death penalty was still being widely used for homicide or just regular jail time, it was definitely starting to be questioned more, which brings us to today, which is going to be over here for 2025. So this is where right now, actually in about 23 states, the death penalty is not allowed, it is banned. So that just goes to show how far we've come to really making this a controversial topic. Some people are for the death penalty, some people are not, but there's a lot of morality that surrounds this topic in whether or not it is okay and humane to put somebody to death because they chose to kill somebody else. It's definitely a very kind of taboo and risky subject in different areas around the United States. And another really big thing that comes up today with the potential punishments for homicide is the risk of putting somebody to death who was wrongfully convicted. This is a problem that we've seen rise a lot, or at least be acknowledged a lot, within the last decades or so. So it really kind of puts that strain around punishment. Alright, let's go ahead and keep going and look at the potential defenses of charge of homicide. So there's quite a few here. Just to name a couple, we've got self-defense or defense of others. You committed a homicide because you were trying to defend yourself or protect somebody else from harm. We've got insanity or mental illness, where maybe the defendant was not mentally competent at the time of the crime, meaning that they did not know what they were doing, they didn't understand it. So a lot of times they'll bring in a forensic psychologist to evaluate the defendant and determine whether or not they're competent to stand trial, or if they were even competent to be charged for this murder or homicide. Let's keep it going and look at accident or lack of intent, kind of like our involuntary manslaughter. This isn't going to get rid of the homicide charge completely, but it could knock it down from a murder to a manslaughter if you can prove that they didn't mean to do it. And that kind of ties in down here to the imperfect defense, which is going to come from voluntary manslaughter. Same thing, we're not getting rid of that charge that you did kill somebody, but it might go from murder to manslaughter if you can prove that it was through adequate provocation or kind of in the heat of the moment, X, Y, and Z. Alright, now we're going to look at a murder from my home state and actually from my hometown, Milford, Michigan. So let's go ahead and look at murder in Michigan. So this is going to take us back to a case all the way from 1995, which is People versus Stinchcomb. However, the records were made public in 1997. So, back on August 9th, 1995, Stinchcomb and his co-defendant had lured two 12-year-old girls into Central Park in Milford, Michigan, which, like I said, is where I'm from, the town where I actually grew up in, park I go to when I go home. My dad actually went to high school with Aaron Stinchcomb, so he has some stories about how he was definitely a little bit off, but Anyway, so basically Stinchcomb and his co-defendant lured out these 12-year-old girls into the night. They premeditated this. They knew they were going to get these girls to sneak out of the sleepover. They promised to bring them alcohol, which they did. They got the girls intoxicated, and it was the girls' first time drinking because they were so young, so they very quickly got intoxicated and were not able to really defend themselves or act how they normally would. So then the two men ended up luring the girls even further into the park, deep into the woods where all the trees are crowding. It was dark, it was late at night, and unfortunately, allegedly, they sexually assaulted both of the girls before strangling them, slitting their throats, stabbing them, beating them, etc. Unfortunately, these two 12-year-old girls died that night due to stab wounds. And then if we can keep looking, we've got the girls' bodies were found 3 days later by a teenage boy walking through the woods. It was the annual summer Milford Memories, which is still a festival that they do today, and the boy was celebrating Milford Memories with his family. He walked off into the woods, and he ended up coming across the bodies of these two girls stuffed into a pipe deep into Central Park. A mix of physical evidence, the witness accounts, and just what the interviewers had been picking up around town led them to Aaron Stinchcomb and his defendant, Ostinger. And after bringing these men in and able to arrest them, Ostinger actually confessed to the crimes and led the police to where they had hidden other evidence like backpacks, clothes, etc. So after that, it really kind of sealed this case in. However, Aaron did not confess to plead guilty. They both went to trial, and they went to trial in early 1996, and Aaron Stinchcomb was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for both of these girls. Then Stinchcomb was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He's still there today, and he is in the Muskegon Correctional Facility, still serving out his life sentence. He was 20 at the time of the crime, so he's probably in his late 50s, early 60s now, and his co-defendant, Ostinger, was about 30 at the time of the crime, and they are both still in prison. So that's an example of a first-degree murder case in my home state and hometown, Michigan. And then here's my references for this slide. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a great day and you learned something about homicide. Bye!